Do you want to just
Okay.
start? Just launch into it then. How's that?
Okay.
It's
Let's
more or
see.
less a who,
So,
what, where, when, why.
yeah, right. So the first questions were really about Wade, and you know, I didn't have a whole lot of contact with Wade as an individual. It was really more through my parents. So uh, when I was in my early 20s, late teens, I would tag along for, you know, dinner parties and things. And so my impressions and my experience of Wade were all really in that context. My parents first met him at Books and Things, which was a little bookstore that Sarah Solly started in Morin Heights.
Yes.
And in the context of that, she had music and art exhibitions. And I remember vividly um, meeting them there because they bought one of my watercolors when I had my first show there. And so, of course, that was amazing. And
Wow.
yeah. Uh, so I didn't really know him as a musician, obviously, because I wasn't a musician. And so just audience, just enjoying those informal kind of get-togethers when he would sing. But I didn't go to folk cafes and stuff really, so I never really saw him performing in a professional kind of way. But in terms of his temperament and of my father's temperament, uh, there was something that they shared, a kind of self-deprecating humor, but also highly critical, politics and cultural conditions and all the rest of it. Uh, but I found them overall in a social setting very charming. Wade especially had a way of being attentive to you as an individual that was really engaging. So even though I was, the younger generation, say in the gathering, he would always treat me so equally. And when I got older, I also saw them when I had children of my own. And I asked my daughter, who was really quite small at the time, how she remembered Wade and Shirley. And she said, "Oh, I just remember that uh, they never paid attention to me like a little child. As children are often expected to be entertaining or they get a special kind of attention." She said they seemed completely engaged in their own adult world and in what they were doing, but they were very welcoming, as though I was just another adult in the group. And I think I had felt that myself in earlier times. Yeah, so in terms of the feel of being around them, it was very, very engaging. And it was really great to be in a setting where they were so creative. There was always this little buzz of, oh, what should we do? What should we do next? And that's why the question about whose idea was it to collaborate? I think it really just came out of that kind of dialogue. It's hard to say, whose idea it would have been. They were always just in that kind of mode of what if and wouldn't this be fun and that kind of discussion.
Do you know when your father started sending those very humorous Christmas cards to Irene and Wade?
That probably was the early 70s. That's my guess. Yeah. He had a whole tradition of that. Uh, Not just with Christmas cards, but in the village of Morin Heights, there was an informal group called the Senate that got together up at George Gardner's garage that had a counter with some awful old coffee. And he would go there in the morning and he would often bring, about once a week, I guess, a cartoon about village politics. And I think that was one of his most genuine and spontaneous moments in his creative life was doing that. And one of those characters, Owen Legally, died fairly recently. And just before he died, he gave me a big bag of copies of some of those
Wow.
cartoons. Yeah, yeah. So
Did your
that
father
was
have political aspirations at all?
no, no. Although he served on the school board when we were all in school, he was on the school board, but he didn't engage in a formal way in municipal politics. But he certainly sniped, from the sidelines.
Sure. Yeah. Was,
uh,
was he strict as a father
um,
or disciplined, perhaps?
he never raised his voice. He never got angry, but he was the master of the freeze, right? If you did something that was not comme il faut, he would freeze you out, and that was just terrible.
Yeah.
So, his kind of waspy background, boarding school background, that all was very present. Um, no elbows on the table, that whole thing was definitely uh, the uh, the way that we lived at home. But he was never a kind of disciplinarian type. And my mother would be more uh, volatile. She'd get mad and yell at us. And once, I was sent up to my room, and on the way up the stairs, I stuck out my tongue at her, behind her back. And my father saw me and called me back downstairs, and made me go and apologize. And it stuck in my mind, how embarrassing that was to be caught, with your emotions kind of out of control. But I think that characterized a lot of his interactions with people, was that sometimes he had strong emotions, but he didn't always show them in his interactions with people. He was a very private person.
Regarding his interactions with people, I'm reminded of the interview that Fred Davis did with him on CBC.
Mm-hmm.
It's in black and white, one of those talking head interviews of the 50s or 60s. And they both seem to be shy with one another. And possibly because Fred Davis was a fairly heavy duty intellectual, but nonetheless, he was talking about cartoons and illustrations that were intended to make people laugh, satirically, I suppose. And there was some distance between them, as if they didn't know whether to laugh or really be serious.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it suggests to me that they were very shy, not so much intimidating each other, but just shy at being in the limelight.
Yeah.
I take it that your dad didn't like to seek attention in that way.
That's right. That's right. And, you asked that question about, did he mind not being recognized? And it did bother him. Sometimes he would express those types of sentiments. And he, sometimes he would say, well, if you're a Canadian, you have to go somewhere else and get recognition, and then you'll be recognized in Canada. He had those kinds of
Sure.
beliefs. But on the other hand, he was so private and so, he just protected his independence, his time, and so you can't have it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
He really managed his interactions with people, and
Did he form lasting friendships, say, from the Merchant Marine during the war, or when he was at Nova Scotia School of Art and Design? Or were there any?
no, but where his lifelong art friends came from was the studio in Montreal that Herman Heimlich ran. That's where he met my mother, and that's where he met Brodie Shearer, Steve Brodie, John Howison. These were all friends that he had right through his whole life until one by one they died. But
No, Wade's wife, Irene
mhm.
Haywood, was an artist as well. Did
Mhm.
Irene and your father know one another as artists? Did they ever
No,
exhibit at the
no.
same time?
Although she wrote, for the Star, the Montreal Star, the Gazette, I can't remember which one. And so I think he knew of her through that writing. But it was only when they met in Morin Heights that we got to know her. I
Yeah.
liked her very much.
Oh, really? Yes,
Yeah,
that's
she
nice.
was a very fine person.
And you got to know Shirley after
Yes,
Irene
and I
passed
love
away?
Shirley too. She was totally different, right? So wild and such a party person and
Yes,
wonderful energy.
yeah. Now, your father did illustrations primarily for Maclean's and the Weekend magazine, but he also illustrated books for John Robert Colombo, for example. I
Mhm.
connected with John a couple of days ago, and he remembers your father's work very, very well, had high regard and respect for your father's work. Were those illustrations his duty, let us say, as an illustrator, because that was his work, that was his job, that was his source of revenue and income? Did they play heavy, prominent roles in your lives? Like, did he speak to you of, oh, I got to get to work, I've got to draw this, I've got to illustrate that?
He was funny about work. He has a studio, or he had a studio here, a separate building from the house. And he just had a very steady work routine. He'd just go in the studio and work and come back for tea or come back for meals. And it was a very private space for him. Wasn't a place where we could crash in and out and bother him.
And he was a
And so,
sculptor as well. Did he do
yeah,
sculpting in that studio too?
there's a basement to it, and that's where he would do the bronze casting and the welded steel. The welded steel outdoors, of course, in the summer.
Yes. So he had a foundry in the basement, did he?
Uh, oh, you should see. You should have seen the foundry. The little structure that housed it is still there. It was a one-man foundry that he built apart from the studio, and so hazardous, so ridiculous that he would work there. But he did, and he did all his own bronze casting. It was
Mhm.
insane. I
I
helped
have,
him a little bit as I got older. And,
yeah. I have a beautiful piece of his called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse.
oh, you have that.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow,
Yeah.
that's welded steel, I believe.
Yes, it is. It's a beautiful
Yeah.
piece. People seeing it here at the house are flummoxed by it. They have no idea what it is. At first, they think it's ugly. And then when I explain what it is, they realize, oh, Don Quixote. Okay, yes, I can see that.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered too, talking about the story of the I'm Alone, if he was ever tempted to sculpt the I'm Alone.
No, it's very interesting what prompted him to do different kinds of work. And the medium was often associated with certain content. Something that's text based, and I consider all his cartooning basically text based, whether it was Hansard or Eric Nicol. It was always in relation to that kind of written or spoken word. But sculpture him was his visual thing, and he had a keen eye for visual puns, visual humor, funny shapes. And so those welded sculptures made of found materials, I think, reflected most closely his cartooning work.
Mhm.
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually, where the gray area is.
Yeah. So the sculptures didn't necessarily make political commentary as such.
No,
They
I
were
don't
works of
think
art.
they ever did. He did some self-published projects like Hyperbole and Pabnik and the Fat posters, and that those were continued that sort of social commentary.
The
You know,
subtitle to that is the pornographics of politics. Why do you think that subtitle?
oh, just because he was so appalled at the corruption that he perceived in politics. I put it all down to having to read Hansard every day for any number of years when he was doing his cartoon for the Financial Post. and it would work him up into such a lather, and he had to just get rid of it, I guess.
Sure. And of course, he is in the Canadian Cartoonist Hall of Fame as a result of all of this work.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And you know, he died in 2007, and that summer uh, he was in the hospital, and he got his medal for, you know, the Giants of the North. And honestly, that meant so much to him, you know, even though he was so out of it physically.
Yeah. When was the first time that you recall having heard the story of the I'm Alone as performed by Wade and the Mountain City Four? And did you ever see it together with your father's storyboard?
No, no. And so for me, this has been just an amazing project to be part of, to observe its evolution. You know, he would do things. I think they did propose it to the NFB. I remember an association of disappointment and, oh, let's just forget about that. He didn't take rejection well, you know, he was very sensitive. And so it wouldn't have been, oh, well, the NFB didn't want it, let's move on, let's self-produce or something. No, it's rejection, that's it. Put it in the drawer and, you know, almost sulk. And so I remember it being a project, but then it died a very quick death and was referred to no more.
And of course, the first page.
Oh, so good.
Yeah.
So good.
One of the very interesting things about this is that he left notations for the animator. And I read them to Peter Weldon a couple of days ago, and it's really obtuse because it's the old technology, of course. You convert the watercolor or the pencil crayon illustrations to film. Yeah. And then, of course, the chorus, as you know, there are 8 choruses because there are 8 verses. Yeah. And it's in this format, the vertical format. And it is to illustrate the ship, the I'm Alone, as it sinks. Oh. It's been attacked by the Dexter and blown out of the water.
That's so fantastic.
His instructions to the animator are, you are to follow the boat down by moving the camera upward. It's kind of strange, but when Alison Wolvers, who's the animator of this video, read these instructions, she was a little bit perplexed, to say the least, because she's used to working only in digital technology.
Of course. And, you know, I remember those big panels he would make for The Observer or some other project that was going to be a film strip. And they would be plotted out very carefully for camera movement, you know. Yes. That was always how he worked.
Essential. Yeah. What became of his archival materials, such as the one you just described?
You know, I think he burned them all.
Really?
My mother described him making these journeys to the incinerator with armloads of material. And, you know, he would always say to me, oh, I don't want to leave you with a big mess to clean up. But it never occurred to me that he would just go and destroy all his work. And then when I asked Mommy after he died, so I'm looking in the studio and I'm not finding anything. And she said, well, I don't know, you know, I don't know what's left.
Do you think this is part of an introspective personality, perhaps, or that sort of thing?
Yeah, very ultra sensitive about revealing himself, maybe.
Yeah, but one of the characteristics that I really enjoy following up on with artwork in particular is source documents. In other words, the spontaneous creative energy that began the ball rolling and then how it follows through to the finished product. So here in this instance, we are denied the source, the first primal push of a lot of his work. That's, in a sense, it's really too bad. But on the other hand, it's it makes the investigation of it somewhat more interesting because we don't know. We never will know.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's that kind of no opportunity to misunderstand because there's nothing to understand. Just
Yeah, and I think he wouldn't have been so interested in being kind of frozen in time. I think the idea that somebody takes that storyboard and makes something almost fresh and new out of it is would have been fine with him.
Mhm.
You know, it's still very much in the spirit and the feel and the look, but it has its own little whimsical attributes that
Yes.
I think he would have liked a lot. You know?
Elizabeth, you mentioned books and things, the bookstore that Sarah Solly operated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And of course, your father had published a few books on his own. Did he ever have book signings at that bookstore?
No, that's interesting. You know, he did hyperbole and those things somewhat earlier. It was kind of before Sarah. And so mostly what she showed of his work were the outdoor sculptures. And I think that she had a nice garden in the back where they would install them. And I think it was a big inspiration for him to have them out there in the garden and having her hosted. And it was a very special time. And I think it was very fruitful, that relationship for him. But not so much with the publications and the books.
Do those works still exist in that garden? Is it all?
Well, it would be an exhibition and people would come and buy them. And that's how so many of those sculptures got into different people's gardens in the area. You know?
Nice.
But there are definitely still a bunch around here, around the house. And I have a friend who does welding who's helping to restore some of them that have been neglected.
You're living in what appears to be a log house or a log cabin. Is that where
Yeah.
your parents lived as
Yep.
well?
Yep, I'm in the house.
And
And
what age is it?
you know, it I think it was built around 1850 originally up in Tamracuda. And then right after the war, when they moved up to Morin Heights, they brought the house from Tamracuda and sited it here. And he built it, you know, over 3 years with some of the locals. And
So he did all the chinking himself.
I don't know how the chores broke down. He definitely had local help, and I think that's how he sort of made his connection with the village was having that group of people helping him.
Yes, I've been to Morin Heights a couple of times at Penny Rose's parties.
Yeah.
And, went sugaring one time with them as well. And I never did meet your father, but of course Wade I would see quite often whenever I was there. And Shirley, Irene had already passed away by the time I got to know Wade. You mentioned, when did you leave Morin Heights then?
I left Morin Heights in 68, straight out of high school. Yeah.
And you went to art school after that, did you?
Oh, I went to art school here and there, yeah. And then I ended up wandering down to New York and just to try to learn things, you know. And my parents always loved New York. And so I guess that was always, I had gone down a lot, you know, just to look at things. I didn't really intend to stay. You know, how you just go down and you think, see what happens, you know?
Yeah. Well, is there anything we should add, do you think, Elizabeth, about your father?
Yeah, you know, I never heard them talk about art school together. And I think, you know, my father went to NASCAD when he was quite young, and he talked about it as this old traditional British style art school. And I think it was really Heimlich and his studio that was the formative influence on him
In Montreal.
creatively. Yeah.
And of course, Wade went to the Ontario College of Art, graduated in 1939. So they had that common interest as well.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. You know, in terms of what kind of father was he definitely encouraged us to not be afraid to be a nonconformist, you might say. And I was remembering, because I came across one in the cupboard, how when each of us hit grade 11, we were obliged to take on the project of the yearbook for the graduating class. And it became a whole creative project that was very non-traditional. And we would get such terrible pushback, you know, from the parents. They'd buy the yearbook and it would be this weird thing.
And now
But
they're collector's items, probably.
but that was part of his way of making sure that we wouldn't flinch if people disapproved of what we did.
Yes, yeah.
And just about the video, love it.
Okay.
I'm sure from wherever he is, he's loving it too.
That's great. I've really enjoyed doing this. And thank you so much for agreeing to do the interview. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for leading the whole project along and including me as well. I appreciate it.
Thank you again. Have a
Okay,
great weekend.
thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So my guest has been Elizabeth Whalley, who is the daughter of Peter Whalley, the cartoonist, illustrator of the story of Yam Alone. Peter died in 2007. He had been inducted into the Canadian Cartoonist Hall of Fame. And as you have heard Elizabeth say, this was something that touched him deeply. Much in the same manner as Wade Hemsworth's being inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. They were great friends and they're great collaborators, not only on the story of Yam Alone, but on a few other projects as well. In fact, in the book, The Songs of Wade Hemsworth, that we published in 1990, Peter Whalley contributed line drawings for the Blackfly song. And they too, of course, are very whimsical and very witty. So thank you very much to Elizabeth Whalley for contributing her recollections of her father, Peter Whalley, and the connection with Wade Hemsworth.